Zach, it's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So, my head, your head, lots of folks' head in America has been spinning
Yeah.
the last couple of months with the big, beautiful bill, which has now been signed into law. There was a lot of back and forth about what was happening, what was going to happen, what's going to happen with AI regulation. And it seems like the moratorium that barred states originally from regulating AI was removed. So, what is the current state of AI regulation going forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there was a lot of dramatics on the road to getting this moratorium removed. There was a huge push to get it worked in, by the way, a push that not everybody in the Trump administration or Trump coalition was necessarily in support of, right? Marsha Blackburn is a key example of that. Somebody whose home state includes Nashville, which has the Elvis Act, which protects the likeness of musicians from being replicated with apps like Suno, with AI music apps. So the AI moratorium was put in. It's a hugely controversial provision, right? Then stripped back out basically at the last minute after Cruz and Blackburn thought they had a deal to include it in a watered down form with carve outs for things like the Elvis Act, with carve outs for things like child protection. At the last minute, it's removed, and then it dies overwhelmingly in a 99 to 1 vote against, which was crazy. I mean, at that point, you basically are hiding who actually supports it because so many people are voting against it as a show of force and as a show, by the way, of not having to actually signal where their own intent is in case something like it comes back up in the next session.
So the removal of the ban, and to your point, we don't know at this point. It's kind of sort of hidden and the reasons that they may hold. What does that mean for federal regulation going forward?
Yeah. Effectively, we have a patchwork system in America. And by default, when we have a patchwork system, the largest states exert outsized influence. So if you think about for a second, one useful analog that I talk to our clients about is the textbook industry, right? Where if you are a textbook publisher, if you're any of the large textbook publishers, and you want to publish a biology textbook in all 50 states, you don't actually write 50 different versions of the textbook. You look at what the largest states by population and by spending require in their textbooks. You might look at a Texas or a California, for example. You make one or at most two different versions of the textbook that adhere to those different regulations, and you roll it out across the country. So in that way, what you find are the states that have disproportionate economic impact and end up actually leading on a lot of this regulatory uncertainty are the ones who have both industry location and the ones who also have spend available. The AI analog for that is California, right? California has both the centerpiece of where all the companies are being built, which is perhaps obvious to say. It also has regulators who, like with SB 1047, which is a hugely controversial bill being pushed by Scott Wiener in the last congressional session in California. It has regulators who have some of the most appetite to actually regulate some of the challenges around AI. And by the way, also have some of the most appetite to blunt some of the growth around AI as well. And it has the size and impact from a population spend perspective to enforce those regulations by de facto across the rest of the country. So my expectation is, while we are currently living in a de facto patchwork system, that states like California, maybe like New York, like Texas, will end up enforcing their own versions of, at worst, the European, or at most, perhaps, the European regulatory regime, and at least a much lighter weight American industry friendly regulatory regime that will end up being adopted nationwide.
So I'm glad you brought up Europe because I was thinking about the patchwork concept, the
Yep.
framework, the image of it with Europe and with what really happened with GDPR, which you saw
Yeah.
the continent more or less, they're coming together. Is the US turning more into almost like a European regulatory system at this point?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say, right? There's certainly factions in America who would love that, right? And by the way, this doesn't properly map onto a left-right. There's no clear party or political affiliation. There are folks on the right and folks on the left who would love to see, for various reasons, right? Folks on the right who have skepticism of big tech, folks on the left who have skepticism of corporate power broadly, which is inclusive of big tech. There are folks on both sides of the aisle who would love to see a closer to European regulatory regime instituted in America. And similarly, by the way, there's a coalition of folks across the right and left who are much less enthusiastic for that because there are real knock-on effects, right? If you are a tech company and you have to comply with GDPR and you have to comply with the European AI Act, right? all of these different questions that come up, European AI regulations and GDPR, mean that companies like even Apple and OpenAI, Apple, who historically has been much more willing to play ball with regulators, by the way, in a variety of countries, not a particularly anti-government business, end up withholding specific features from Europe because it is easier for them to lose out on billions of dollars of revenue than it is to comply with the difficult and unfortunately extreme, in some cases, regulation that comes out of Europe. So I think it would be challenging. And by the way, part of the perspective of the current admin is that some of these regulations in Europe, particularly on AI, are in effect similar to tariffs. They're effectively competitive blockers that are meant to help European tech companies at the expense of American companies. So I don't think America is turning into Europe anytime soon. There's certainly those who would like to have it happen in states like California, particularly, but it's going to be a question of what kind of pushback is there at the federal level. That's why there was the desire to have this preemption, this moratorium to begin with, and also what happens even at state levels with states who have real influence that both balance the balancing act of American companies succeeding and also making sure that the harms, and there are some harms affiliated with AI, making sure the harms don't grow disproportionately large.
Haven't we heard, though, from President Trump in the past that he was pro-federal AI regulation? And I'm curious what happened during the course of the negotiations for this bill that it got to this point that he ultimately signed, where now we do have this patchwork.
Well, think about it this way. You can be pro-regulation for one of two reasons, right? Sometimes you're pro-regulation.
Federal, right? But federal.
Yeah,
so
yeah,
now
yeah.
we're getting, now he's lost power in some way.
Well, I think that's one way of looking at it. I think you can say, look, we are pro-federal regulation because it sets a floor and a baseline, and it resolves the question of uncertainty. And my intuition, I have little inside information on that. My intuition is that that's where the talk of I'm pro-regulation comes from. Or you can be pro-regulation because it sets a ceiling, right? You're saying, look, this much and no more. And those are two very different perspectives to have. Both resolve uncertainty, but do so in very different ways. If you reach out to a Senator Blackburn, right, Blackburn might say, look, part of the reason why I backed away from the moratorium is because I think the federal government hasn't done its job by setting clear boundaries and guidelines on AI regulation. And what I suspect is that there's some sense of that within the admin itself, much more than the perhaps alternatively popular look. We have to ensure that there is a floor and then states feel free to build on top of, right, what AI regulation might be.
I think the bigger question, as this has shown us, is that the challenges of regulation and setting those policies going forward has this new element of what the administration has, I think, ushered in again this second term of state power versus federal power, and how that debate philosophically, is going to shape everything going forward, but ultimately how it butts up against national priorities like developing AI for the country's security purposes, national security purposes, and for to counter China and things like that. So I'm curious how you're watching that friction butt up against the development and innovation cycle that tech entrepreneurs are really racing toward right now.
Yeah, well, think about AI development in two ways, right? There's AI development at the app layer, and there's AI development at the infrastructure layer. And where you really start to see, I think, the hidden impact of state power is at the infrastructural layer. Because the truth is that states can regulate at the app layer, and they probably will over time, but ultimately there will be some clear federal guidance on, look, here's what we allow. In the same way we've done that for social media and so many other areas, that'll be resolved. The infrastructural layer is much more amenable to state power because AI infrastructure is dependent upon energy pipelines, data centers, permitting and zoning laws, which don't just get at state, they get at local and even city level. And so you end up in this sort of strange dynamic where you have cities that effectively have a choke point. In fact, if you go back to the very founding of the country, you find one of the reasons we said states could not mint their own currency or have international trade or have their own international trade policy is so that we didn't end up with this patchwork economic control by states that then impacts national security. And we're actually recreating that same dynamic, right? Where we have states who have outsized influence and cities who have outsized influence on building data centers, on energy abundance and things of this nature, zoning and so on and so forth. But the impact is not just economic, it's national security and its orientation. So I'm tracking, by the way, who are the largest places, Northern Virginia is among them, right, that have built tremendous amounts of data centers? What are some of the emerging critiques on the left around environmental concerns of data centers, around gentrification, around things of that nature? And also, what are the emerging consensus on the right and center left around things like energy abundance that will enable new power centers to come online? Because the truth is, and by the way, this was in the House AI Task Force report, there's a huge understanding of the fact there's a mismatch between energy cycles, right, which happen on much longer time horizons, and then training new model cycles, which are actually on much shorter horizons. And so even if today we enabled huge new sources of energy to come online, nuclear fusion, right, renewable and clean and abundant sources of energy to come online today, it still might not be enough without some of the less popular things like coal to come online too, or like natural gas to come online too, to actually stand up these data centers in time to continue at the bleeding edge where a lot of these frontier labs are playing.
Well, I mean, you hit on a very important point, because one of the aspects of the big beautiful bill is to actually take money away from the new energy developments, which we know are critical as AI consumes much more energy. And all I'm hearing from you really are more reasons that I feel the development of AI, the pace of it might be a little bit rockier going forward because of these interconnected challenges and the legal fights that I'm sure will ensue. Is that the right way to be thinking about the future here? Or do you think that somehow the scale of these platforms will override the political friction that we're feeling in getting the rules in place to let them breathe and develop?
Well, there's some nuance to it, right? I mean, the reality is there's the political fight that happened at the same time as the big beautiful bill. And the headline there, of course, is the Trump-Elon breakup, right?
Yes.
And that was a huge overshadow. And so I think some of the things you're referencing on some of the challenges of clean energy are things that directly impact Elon, right? Like subsidies for clean cars, electric cars, and things of that nature. At the same time, by the way, there are actually new incentives built into the bill on things like hydrogen, for example, which are actually helpful for if you're building data centers. So I think some of the challenge is it's not a clear, better, worse, same analogy. In certain ways, I think it impacts the broader market skews, but in certain ways, I hope it'll accelerate the development of data centers.
It just feels like there's so much friction in the pipeline process that I can't imagine what the AI experience might look like for someone living in California, let's say, in 5 years versus someone living in Virginia or, in Vermont. Is that the wrong way to think about maybe some of the challenges that might arise with more patchwork regulation, that the experience of AI is actually different depending on where you live in the United States?
I think it's very possible. I don't think it'll be, I would be surprised if the core experience is different between a California or a Vermont or a Virginia or wherever. But could you see things that are highly controversial wedge issues start to look different? Of course. Could you see things like the question of child safety look very different? The definition of what constitutes child safety in California is very different than what constitutes child safety in a place like Virginia, right? And we've seen that, by the way, play out on other issues historically. So I think the way to think about it is, look, AI is not a new fight on the culture war issue. It's a layer that falls across every other existing fight in the culture war issue. It's a new front for each one of them. So where state...
No, sorry, go ahead.
No. Where states already have existing patchwork differentiation is where I expect they'll continue to have patchwork differentiation moving forward.
I think it's just fascinating to see how different each state feels about regulation and how far apart some of them can be. I mean, we're all Americans. And I also think about the legacy or the longevity of some of the terms of these policymakers inside the states. They're going to move on to the next stage of their career, and then you have somebody else coming in who may have a completely different view of regulation. And so, it just seems so fraught. I guess I keep coming back to this point because I don't really see a clean path forward for these companies to navigate. And it seems like it will be a landscape that evolves every 2 to 4 years, depending on the political cycle. Is that also the right way to think about the future?
I think you're dead on, right? We're looking, AI is political football right now. And the sense is it's moving back and forth. After World War II, there was a post-war liberal, I don't mean liberal politically, I mean liberal economically, post-war liberal order that regardless of party, more or less stayed intact for a number of years, right? And the culmination of that might be something like international free trade agreements, right? The backlash to the post-war liberal order is such that on both sides now, in both parties, there's an increasing influence of the value of industrial policy. I mean, right now, or I think it's next week, there's a huge, our friends at NIA are doing a huge reindustrialized summit, right? Only a couple of days from now. And by the way, widely attended on both sides of the aisle. The more that industrial policy becomes central to American dominance and American national security and American competitiveness, which it already is, the more that things like AI become political football because it is highly salient and highly polarized as an issue.
But you also mentioned earlier in our conversation that within the states, it's not always a clear-cut blue or red issue. So share with us, as you look at the general trends, what AI concerns sort of most states are focused on, or are states most focused on? And are there any trends in terms of blue and red states specifically, like as states, and then maybe the underlying issues within, purple states, where you see some more, some nuance in the concerns that certain parties may have?
Yeah, I would say AI at the state level tends to be downstream of two things. AI regulation tends to be downstream of economic concerns, which vary on a state-by-state basis, which I'll go into, and also cultural concerns, which map a little bit more to the blue state, red state, purple state sort of model, right? So the economic concerns tend to be really local at best, right? That's why you see things like Tennessee making sure that music is protected given the influence of Nashville, right? Or places like New York that tend to care about things like that. So you have things that are downstream of what the state politicians and their existing economic relationships care about. And that's a cycle that plays out basically every time there's a new paradigm of tech. I mean, the classic example for this is what Rupert Murdoch has done in places like Australia and Canada, where there's been, bills that have forced Google and others to pay for linking to news. That's directly downstream of existing economic interests in those places. That's on the one side. On the culture war side, then you start to map a little bit more to red, blue, purple, right? And what I would expect to see, this is, by the way, ahead of the curve, you're not there yet, but what I would expect to see are states who have done things like regulate internet pornography, for an example, crack down really, really aggressively. States have already started to crack down on things like deepfakes, which, by the way, is a purple state issue. It's basically universal for a variety of well-regarded ethical reasons, of course. But states then go to the next step and say, all right, states that already make it harder to access pornography for minors and children under public safety issues and with age verification may then take one step further and say, okay, this is a great time for us to now extend these regulations that already have broad appeal and approval in those states, which tend to be more red states, into AI regulation. My expectation is blue states, the question will be much more of, and this is what we saw in SB 1047, much more of the undefined but potential harms of AI. So for example, cracking down on things like open source AI, right, where there's a little bit more of a government centralization question, that tends to be more popular in California than it might be in Texas, even though it doesn't perfectly map to a red state, blue state, Republican, Democrat model.
So what I'm hearing is that if you add all of the states' concerns together, they're more or less agree on generally the same problems or what they feel could be concerns going forward. It's more of a prioritization. So for example, in Tennessee, depending on the industries that are driving your economy.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to say it. One other way of saying it might be, look, there is a core set of issues they agree on, things like deepfakes, right, that are ethical in their consideration. And then there's second order considerations. For example, the impact of open source AI, which is probably much more highly salient in a place like California, or the impact of music, right, on AI, which might be more salient in a place like Tennessee. And those questions are ones that are ultimately going to have to be resolved at the federal level. Because the truth is, if Tennessee says we're going to block musicians' likeness from being deployed, right, the most likely outcome is that services turn off in Tennessee far more than it is that they then pull out of the United States entirely. If you're a Marsha Blackburn and you really want to protect musicians, you have to resolve that question at the federal level. And this is why I still think there will be a comprehensive, it'll be slower, but there will be a comprehensive AI regulation package at some point, likely the next Congress, right? Because all of these questions can't be resolved at the state level alone, particularly in the 48 states or 47 states that don't have outsized economic impact.
Right, and because as you mentioned, the core issues are still the same for most of the states. I want to move
Correct.
into some specific companies
Yeah.
as we round out the conversation. The big one, of course, Nvidia. Nvidia, about I guess 2 years ago at this point, started to comply with regulation that would that prevented them from exporting certain chips to AI. But the CEO Jensen Huang has actually said that there's sort of more effective ways. And you also said on X that this is an AI policy crisis and that the U.S. should reverse the decision about these export controls. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, so last night, as we're recording this, which I hope it doesn't date the podcast too
Yeah.
much, last night the announcement came out that Nvidia would be allowed to export H20s again to China. These are chips that are originally designed to go to China, but by the way, there's a huge demand for them domestically as well, even though they were designed to comply with export regulations. The crisis at the moment is this. Jensen has, by the way, to his credit, Jensen has mounted a really effective lobbying campaign in the admin and even more quietly, by the way, in the Congress, particularly in the House, where he has built the case over time for why American dominance and Nvidia dominance are tightly linked together. Not to editorialize, my personal perspective is that the challenge of allowing Nvidia to export chips is there is currently a fig leaf where we have said, look, we don't think the Chinese military, and by the way, Jensen said this, which is what I talk about next, we don't think the Chinese military will ever use American chips because it's so hard to get access to them. Of course, that's predicated, it's a bit of a tautology, right? It's predicated on the idea that it is hard to get access to them. If we relax export controls on chips like H20s, we are dealing ourselves two blows at once. The first blow is that American companies who would benefit from these chips are losing, even purely, by the way, outside of the realm of the military, are losing access to Chinese companies who will then have first dibs on a very large pile of chips NVIDIA manufactures for them. And manufacturing is still a throughput challenge for semiconductors. That's the first challenge. Second challenge is that these chips will make their way, and if you don't believe that, I think it's a little bit naive. These chips will make their way, way into the hands of the Chinese government, the Chinese military, and they will be deployed offensively, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, against America and American interests. And the idea that we can allow these chips to go into Chinese civilian hands without them being at all influenced by the CCP is a little bit of a convenient truth we tell ourselves to allow for the growth of NVIDIA at the cost of risking American allies like Taiwan and even risking America's interests directly at home too. I think it's a really big challenge. By the way, in April, there was an announcement that we're going to cut back on exports to China, cut back on these specific H20 exports from NVIDIA to China, which was then quickly reversed. And my hope would be that the admin would reverse it as well, or at the very least, given that we understand, of course, this is part of a much larger trade package with China, ensure that if China reneges on their component of the trade package, that we don't still allow the export of H20 chips as a byproduct of China showing good faith at one point in the negotiating process.
So you're saying just make this cleaner and have the controls there, because if they're going to get their hands on it anyway, you're just hurting NVIDIA. Is that sort of between the lines?
Well, I would say you're hurting America, right? I think highly of NVIDIA, but my concern is, country's policy first and NVIDIA's policy is a distant second. So yes, go ahead.
No, I was just saying because you had said before that NVIDIA's and linked itself to America. So I was
Yes.
going there with you.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's Jensen's argument, right? Which is that
Right.
the two are intrinsically linked.
Do you agree with him?
I think there is no individual company that is, by the way, if there is one individual company that is most linked to American success and dominance, it might be TSMC before it's NVIDIA, right? Like there are other companies that I don't believe any company is, but if you believe that there might be one, it may not be NVIDIA, and there are other companies that have stronger claim to that than NVIDIA itself.
Last question about the rest of big tech. Lots of AI talent spending, rumors flying about how much these pay packages are from Meta, but they did buy Scale AI, $14 billion. Then you have Google getting a $2 billion licensing deal with Windsurf. Is there enough money to kind of go around? I mean, thinking about just how much investment is in general needed for the infrastructure.
Yeah, it's a great question. There is more money in venture today than ever before. And part of that is the institutionalization, right, of large venture. And I know you asked about big tech, but this is upstream of that, right? Which is to say there's more money flowing into venture than ever before because the institutionalization of big tech, which means there are more companies being founded than ever before and raising larger rounds, which means ultimately these companies are being absorbed in more unique ways. Part of it's a regulatory concern, right? Part of it is Lena Khan obviously cracked down in her time at the FTC, and that's being continued by the Trump admin. on big tech mergers. That goes back to what we talked about earlier about the sort of nonpartisan overlap of people who are more skeptical of big tech on the right. So because you have one, more cash flowing in and more companies flowing, so people are leaving big tech to start new companies, able to raise and able to hire. And at the same time, you also have big tech unable to acquire them in the traditional way. In some ways, it's actually cheaper than it ever was before, if you actually think sort of all the way through, in the sense that, yes, there are certainly jaw-dropping numbers being thrown around, but if you only, in a world where you only have to hire 40 employees at Windsurf, the Google acquisition, was only 40 employees of 100 were left over, right? And then a dividend, a $2 billion dividend back out to the cap table. That is actually cheaper on an SBC, on a stock-based compensation basis, than it would be to hire all 140 of them and still dividend out and still write a large check to the cap table as it stands, and then retain all 140 with earnout bonuses the way that a traditional acquisition might have looked a few years ago. So yes, we're in a moment of maybe additional pacing, but some of these deals are actually more interestingly structured and maybe not as expensive as it may be.
Well, that's the whole idea of going asset light. And I want to correct myself and clarify that the $2 billion licensing deal is to get the CEO from Windsurf. So
the CEO and the 40 employees.
CEO. Yeah. So I think we have a lot more to talk about. I know you're hopping off to do lots of other great things. So enjoyed chatting with you today and hope to have you back on soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Take care.
Take care.